Welcome to another peaceful journey through history. Tonight, we explore a time long past when ordinary people faced extraordinary challenges with quiet determination. We will discover how medieval communities survived the Black Death and other pandemics that swept across their world. This is a story of human resilience, told gently to help you drift into restful sleep. The year was 1347. Ships arrived at European ports carrying more than silk and spices from distant lands. They carried invisible passengers that would change the course of history. The Black Death, as it came to be known, was not the first pandemic to visit medieval Europe, nor would it be the last. But its impact was so profound that it reshaped entire societies in ways both terrible and transformative. The plague began its journey along the ancient trade routes that connected east and west. These same paths that brought prosperity to medieval cities also became highways for disease. Merchant caravans traveled slowly across vast distances, stopping at trading posts and cities along the way. In each place they paused, they unknowingly left behind the seeds of catastrophe. The disease likely originated somewhere in Central Asia, in the grasslands where nomadic peoples lived alongside their animals. Rats and their fleas were common companions to human settlements, scurrying through grain stores and dwelling places. No one understood then that these small creatures carried death in their blood. The bacteria Yersinia pestis lived quietly in this ecosystem for generations, waiting for the right conditions to spread beyond its natural boundaries. As trade networks expanded and cities grew larger, these conditions finally aligned. The bacteria found new hosts, new pathways, new opportunities to travel. Ships became floating incubators for disease. Rats nested in cargo holds filled with grain and cloth. Fleas jumped from rat to rat, and sometimes from rat to human. By the time ships reached their destinations, the invisible passengers had already begun their deadly work. The Black Death arrived in Europe through the ports of the Mediterranean. Genoa, Venice, and other trading cities were among the first to experience its effects. From these coastal centers, the disease spread inland along rivers and roads. It moved with the rhythm of medieval commerce, following the same routes that connected communities across the continent. The journey from port to port was slow by modern standards, but relentless in its progression. Ships would dock at one harbor, unload their cargo and passengers, then continue to the next destination. At each stop, some crew members might fall ill, but ships rarely remained in port long enough for the full scope of infection to become apparent. By the time people realized what was happening, multiple ships had already departed for other destinations, carrying the disease with them. The overland routes were equally effective at spreading infection. Merchant caravans stopped at inns and trading posts along major roads. Pilgrims traveled between religious sites, gathering in large groups at shrines and monasteries. Soldiers moved between campaigns, carrying diseases from one region to another. All of these movements created opportunities for the plague bacteria to find new communities to infect. People of the 14th century had no understanding of bacteria or how disease actually spread from person to person. They lived in a world where illness was mysterious, often attributed to supernatural forces or divine displeasure. When the plague arrived, they tried to make sense of it using the knowledge they possessed. Some believed it was punishment for sin. Others thought it came from poisoned air or unfavorable alignments of the planets. The theory of miasma, or bad air, was particularly influential in medieval medical thinking. Physicians believed that corrupted air caused disease, especially air that carried foul odors from rotting organic matter. This theory led to various preventive measures focused on purifying the air through pleasant smells and avoiding areas where bad odors were concentrated. While these measures were based on incorrect understanding of disease transmission, they sometimes had beneficial effects by encouraging people to avoid crowded, unsanitary conditions. Astrological explanations for the plague were also common among educated people. Medieval scholars studied the movements of planets and stars, believing that celestial events influenced earthly affairs. When the plague struck, astronomers pointed to various planetary conjunctions and alignments that they thought might have caused the disaster. These explanations provided a framework for understanding catastrophe, even if they offered little practical guidance for prevention or treatment. Religious interpretations of the plague were perhaps the most widespread and influential. Many people believed that God had sent the disease as punishment for humanity's sins. This belief led to various forms of religious response, from increased prayer and penance to more extreme forms of self-mortification. Some groups organized public processions and ceremonies designed to appease divine anger and earn forgiveness for collective sins. The disease manifested in several forms, each terrifying in its own way. Bubonic plague caused painful swellings called buboes to appear in the lymph nodes. These dark, swollen masses typically formed in the armpits, groin, or neck. The buboes could grow to the size of apples or eggs, causing excruciating pain to those afflicted. The name Black Death may have come from these dark swellings or from the blackened skin that sometimes appeared in the final stages of illness. Pneumonic plague affected the lungs, causing victims to cough blood and struggle for breath. This form of the disease was particularly frightening because it spread directly from person to person through droplets expelled when infected people coughed or sneezed. Families caring for loved ones with pneumonic plague often became infected themselves, creating tragic chains of death within households. Septicemic plague infected the bloodstream, causing rapid death before other symptoms had time to develop fully. Victims of this form might appear healthy in the morning and be dead by evening. The speed of septicemic plague made it particularly demoralizing for communities, as people could die before receiving last rites or saying goodbye to their families. Each form of plague brought its own pattern of suffering and death. Bubonic plague victims might linger for days or even weeks, giving families time to care for them and prepare for death. Pneumonic plague typically killed within a few days of symptom onset. Septicemic plague could kill within hours. These different timelines created different challenges for families and communities trying to cope with the crisis. The mortality rates varied by location and circumstances, but they were universally devastating. Some communities lost half or more of their population within a few months. Others experienced slower but still catastrophic losses over longer periods. The demographic impact was so severe that many regions did not return to their pre-plague population levels for centuries. In those first terrible years, as the disease spread across Europe, people responded with a mixture of fear, faith, and practical determination. Some fled to the countryside, hoping to escape the contaminated air of cities. The wealthy often had country estates where they could retreat with their families and servants. These refuges offered some protection, as rural areas typically had lower population densities and less contact with infected travelers. Others gathered in churches to pray for deliverance, believing that collective worship might earn divine mercy. Churches became focal points for community response to the crisis. People sought comfort in familiar rituals and teachings, even as those same gatherings may have facilitated disease transmission. The tension between spiritual needs and practical health concerns created difficult choices for religious and secular leaders. Many people simply continued with their daily routines, caring for sick family members and trying to maintain normal life as much as possible. This response reflected both practical necessity and psychological coping mechanisms. Work still needed to be done, children still needed care, and communities still required basic services. Maintaining routines provided stability and purpose during chaotic times. Medieval people understood that illness could be contagious, even if they did not understand how contagion actually worked. They noticed that disease seemed to pass from person to person, and they developed various strategies to protect themselves. Some avoided contact with the sick entirely, though this was often impossible for family members caring for afflicted relatives. Others limited their exposure by keeping interactions brief or maintaining physical distance when possible. The burning of aromatic herbs and incense became common practices for purifying air and warding off disease. People carried small sachets of fragrant herbs or wore amulets containing pleasant-smelling substances. They fumigated their homes with burning herbs and spices. While these practices were based on incorrect theories about disease transmission, they may have provided some psychological comfort and occasionally kept people away from infected areas. The concept of quarantine was not unknown in medieval Europe. Italian cities had already begun isolating arriving ships and travelers during previous outbreaks of disease. These early quarantine practices were based on observations that disease often spread through travel and trade, even if people did not understand the specific mechanisms involved. When the Black Death arrived, quarantine practices expanded and became more systematic. Venice established the first formal quarantine station on an island in its lagoon called Lazzaretto Vecchio. Ships were required to wait for 40 days before unloading their cargo or passengers. This 40-day period gave the name quarantine to the practice, from the Italian word quaranta, meaning 40. The choice of 40 days was probably influenced by religious significance rather than medical understanding, as 40 appears frequently in biblical contexts. Other Italian cities quickly adopted similar measures. Genoa, Pisa, and Marseille all established quarantine facilities for incoming ships. These early public health measures represented remarkable organizational achievements for medieval communities. They required cooperation between merchants, sailors, city officials, and medical authorities. They also required significant financial resources to maintain facilities and personnel. Cities erected barriers and checkpoints to control movement in and out of their boundaries. Guards were posted at gates to examine travelers for signs of illness. Some communities sealed themselves off entirely, refusing to admit anyone from the outside world. These measures had mixed success, but they demonstrated that medieval people were capable of organized public health responses when faced with serious threats. The effectiveness of quarantine measures varied considerably depending on how strictly they were enforced and how well they were designed. Some quarantine stations were little more than holding areas, where infected and healthy people were mixed together, creating ideal conditions for disease transmission. Others were more carefully organized, with separate facilities for different categories of travelers and systematic observation periods. Within infected communities, daily life took on a grim routine that revolved around caring for the sick and disposing of the dead. Families cared for their sick members as best they could, using remedies passed down through generations. They prepared herbal teas and poultices, believing that certain plants had healing properties. Willow bark was used to reduce fever, though people did not understand that it contained compounds similar to modern aspirin. Garlic was thought to purify the blood and ward off evil influences. Rosewater and other pleasant-smelling substances were applied to ward off the corrupted air that was believed to carry disease. People made elaborate mixtures of herbs, spices, and oils to create protective ointments and inhalants. These preparations often included expensive imported ingredients, like cinnamon, cloves, and exotic resins. The wealthy could afford more elaborate remedies, while the poor relied on locally available plants and simple preparations. The daily routine of caring for plague victims was both physically and emotionally exhausting. Patients required constant attention, as their conditions could change rapidly. Fever had to be managed with cool cloths and beverages. Buboes were sometimes lanced or treated with hot poultices, though these interventions were often more harmful than helpful. Family members took turns sitting with the sick, providing comfort and companionship during their final hours. People also turned to religious practices for protection and comfort. They prayed more frequently than usual, attended church services when possible, and made pilgrimages to holy sites. Some believed that wearing religious medals or carrying blessed objects would provide divine protection. Others engaged in acts of penance, thinking that suffering in this life might earn mercy in the next. The practice of making vows and promises to God became common during plague years. People promised to build churches, make pilgrimages, or give money to charity if they or their loved ones survived the disease. These vows created ongoing obligations that influenced community life for years after the immediate crisis had passed. Many churches and charitable institutions trace their origins to pledges made during plague years. Religious processions and public ceremonies were organized to seek divine intervention. Entire communities would gather to pray, sing hymns, and carry religious relics through the streets. These events provided emotional outlets for collective grief and fear, even as they may have contributed to disease transmission by bringing large numbers of people together. The role of physicians during the plague years was particularly challenging and often dangerous. Medieval doctors worked within a medical system inherited from ancient Greek and Roman sources, particularly the writings of Galen and Hippocrates. They believed that illness resulted from imbalances in the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This theory provided a framework for understanding disease, even though it was fundamentally incorrect. Treatments based on humoral theory were designed to restore proper balance through various means. Physicians would examine patients carefully, looking for signs that might indicate which humors were out of balance. They considered factors like skin color, pulse rate, urine appearance, and overall demeanor. Based on these observations, they would prescribe treatments designed to adjust the patient's humoral balance. Bloodletting was one of the most common medical interventions during plague years. Doctors believed that removing excess blood would help rebalance the humors and restore health. They used various techniques, including cutting veins with sharp instruments, applying leeches to draw blood gradually, or using heated cups to create suction that would pull blood to the surface of the skin. The practice of bloodletting was based on sincere medical theory and careful observation of patient responses. Physicians noticed that some patients seemed to improve temporarily after bloodletting, though they did not understand that this might be due to the body's natural fluctuations rather than the treatment itself. Unfortunately, bloodletting likely weakened patients further at a time when they needed all their strength to fight infection. Physicians also prescribed various herbal remedies and dietary changes based on humoral theory. They recommended avoiding certain foods that were thought to promote imbalance, while encouraging consumption of others believed to strengthen the body. Wine was often prescribed as medicine, both for its supposed healing properties and because it was safer to drink than water in many urban areas where sanitation was poor. The preparation and sale of medicines was typically handled by apothecaries, who were skilled in mixing herbs, minerals, and other substances into therapeutic compounds. Their shops were filled with jars and bottles containing ingredients from around the known world. Local herbs like chamomile, sage, and thyme were mixed with exotic imports like ginger, pepper, and various resins and oils. Expensive substances like unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusk, were reserved for wealthy patients who could afford such rarities. Common folk relied on simpler remedies made from local plants that could be gathered or grown in household gardens. Many families maintained their own knowledge of herbal medicine, passed down through generations of women who served as primary caregivers. The role of women in medical care during plague years was particularly important, though often overlooked in historical records. While male physicians received formal training and official recognition, women typically provided most day-to-day health care within families and communities. They gathered and prepared herbal medicines, cared for sick children and elderly relatives, and assisted with childbirth and other medical emergencies. Some women developed considerable expertise in medical matters, becoming known throughout their communities for their healing skills. These informal practitioners often had more practical experience with common ailments than formally trained physicians. During plague years, when demand for medical care far exceeded the supply of official doctors, these women often became essential healthcare providers for their neighborhoods. Religious authorities also played important roles in responding to the plague crisis. Priests provided spiritual comfort to the dying and their families, performing last rites, hearing confessions, and offering reassurance about the afterlife. These spiritual services were considered essential for ensuring proper passage from earthly life to eternal salvation. Many clergy members died while caring for plague victims, demonstrating considerable personal courage in the face of mortal danger. Priests, monks, and nuns continued to visit the sick and dying even when it became clear that such contact often led to infection. Their commitment to pastoral duty provided comfort to communities and helped maintain social cohesion during crisis periods. Some religious communities developed their own approaches to caring for the sick that went beyond spiritual consolation. Monasteries and convents often served as hospitals, providing food, shelter, and basic medical care to plague victims. Nuns and monks had experience in herbal medicine and were often more skilled than secular caregivers in treating various ailments. Monastic communities were particularly well positioned to provide systematic care during plague years. They had established routines for communal living, experience in managing resources during difficult times, and philosophical frameworks for understanding suffering and death. Their libraries often contained medical texts, and their gardens produced medicinal herbs. The overwhelming number of deaths during plague years created enormous practical challenges for surviving communities. Traditional burial practices became impossible to maintain when dozens or hundreds of people died each day in a single community. Individual graves could not be dug quickly enough, and elaborate funeral ceremonies became dangerous gatherings that might spread disease further. The normal process of preparing bodies for burial also became difficult or impossible. Families traditionally washed and dressed their dead, held wakes where community members could pay respects, and organized funeral processions to burial sites. During plague years, these practices had to be abbreviated or eliminated entirely to reduce the risk of further infection. Many communities resorted to mass graves, where multiple bodies were buried together in large pits. These burial sites were blessed by priests when possible, but the usual rituals of death were necessarily abbreviated. Families mourned their dead in private, unable to hold the traditional gatherings that normally helped communities process grief together. The sight and smell of death became constant companions in plague-stricken areas. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried, creating public health hazards as well as psychological trauma. Carts moved through city streets to collect the dead, a grim parade that became part of daily routine. The psychological impact of this constant presence of mortality was profound, affecting survivors in ways that would influence European culture for generations. Some communities organized systematic approaches to body disposal that helped maintain basic sanitation and public order. They appointed officials responsible for collecting and burying the dead, established schedules for cart routes through different neighborhoods, and designated specific areas for mass burial sites. These organizational efforts required considerable cooperation and resources during times when both were in short supply. Despite these horrors, many communities maintained remarkable resilience and social cohesion. Neighbors helped neighbors when possible, sharing food, medicine, and comfort during the darkest periods. Those who remained healthy often took responsibility for orphaned children or elderly people who had lost their caregivers. Practical cooperation continued even as traditional social structures were strained to their breaking points. The bonds formed during plague years often proved lasting and influential. People who had helped each other survive the crisis maintained special relationships long after the immediate danger had passed. These connections sometimes crossed social boundaries that had been rigid before the plague, creating new forms of community solidarity that influenced social development for generations. Economic life also adapted to plague conditions in various ways. When workers died, wages for survivors often increased dramatically because labor became scarce and therefore valuable. Surviving peasants found themselves in better bargaining positions with their landlords, able to demand higher wages or better working conditions. Some gained access to land and opportunities that would have been impossible before the plague created such demographic disruption. The economic changes brought about by massive mortality were complex and varied by region and occupation. In some areas, the value of land decreased because there were fewer people to work it or pay rent for it. In others, competition for skilled craftsmen drove wages to unprecedented levels. These economic shifts contributed to long-term social changes that would influence European development for centuries. Trade networks that had carried the disease across continents also proved resilient in the face of catastrophe. Merchants continued to move goods from place to place, though they adopted new precautions designed to reduce the risk of spreading disease. Ships were inspected more carefully before being allowed to dock. Goods were sometimes left to air out before being handled. Business relationships were maintained through letters when face-to-face meetings became too dangerous. The continuation of trade during plague years was essential for maintaining supplies of food, medicine, and other necessities. Communities that had lost significant portions of their population often could not produce everything they needed locally. Trade connections allowed them to obtain essential goods from regions that had been less severely affected by disease. Some merchants developed new business practices specifically designed to operate safely during plague conditions. They established ways of conducting transactions without direct personal contact, used intermediaries to handle potentially contaminated goods, and developed new routes that avoided areas known to be heavily infected. These innovations sometimes proved useful even after the immediate plague threat had passed. The social consequences of plague extended beyond immediate survival concerns and economic disruption. Communities that had lived together peacefully for generations sometimes turned against each other in their fear and desperation. Minority groups, particularly Jewish communities, became scapegoats for disasters that no one understood. Accusations of well poisoning and other conspiracies led to terrible persecution in many parts of Europe. These attacks on Jewish communities were based on ancient prejudices and religious differences that became more virulent during times of crisis. When people could not explain or control the plague, they looked for someone to blame. Jewish communities, already marginalized and different in their religious practices, became convenient targets for fear and anger that had no other outlet. The persecution of Jews during plague years revealed both the worst and best aspects of medieval society. While some groups engaged in violence against innocent neighbors, others attempted to provide protection. Certain rulers issued proclamations defending Jewish residents and threatening punishment for those who attacked them. Some Christian clergy spoke out against persecution, arguing that the plague affected all communities regardless of religion. Individual families sometimes hid threatened neighbors until immediate dangers passed. These acts of courage and compassion showed that human decency could survive even in the most difficult circumstances. The people who protected their Jewish neighbors often did so at considerable personal risk, as they might face retaliation from hostile mobs. The long-term social changes brought about by the Black Death were profound and lasting. Traditional feudal relationships between lords and peasants were permanently altered by the demographic disruption and economic changes caused by massive mortality. The old system, based on abundant labor and scarce land, gave way to new arrangements where surviving workers had greater leverage and mobility. Before the plague, peasants were typically bound to the land where they were born, owing labor service to their lords in exchange for the right to farm small plots. After the plague, when labor was scarce and land was abundant, these arrangements began to break down. Surviving peasants could often find better opportunities elsewhere, forcing landlords to offer improved conditions to retain workers. These changes in rural social relationships contributed to broader transformations in European society. The rigid hierarchy of feudalism gradually gave way to more flexible arrangements based on monetary payments rather than personal obligations. This shift toward market relationships had profound implications for economic development and social mobility. Urban communities also experienced significant social changes as a result of plague mortality. Traditional craft guilds lost many of their members and had to rebuild their organizations with modified membership requirements. Some crafts disappeared entirely when all the skilled practitioners died. Others evolved new techniques and practices as surviving craftsmen adapted to changed circumstances. The Black Death was not the only pandemic to affect medieval Europe, though it was certainly the most devastating in terms of mortality and social impact. Earlier outbreaks had provided some precedents for community responses, though none had prepared Europe for the scale of the 14th century disaster. The Justinian plague of the 6th century had similarly disrupted Byzantine society and other parts of the Mediterranean world. This earlier pandemic was also caused by the same bacteria that would later cause the Black Death, though it affected different regions and populations. Various influenza epidemics had swept across Europe in earlier centuries, each teaching hard lessons about survival and community resilience. These smaller outbreaks had helped some communities develop basic understanding of disease transmission and quarantine procedures, though nothing had prepared them adequately for the scale of the Black Death. After the Black Death, other disease outbreaks continued to challenge European communities on a regular basis. The plague bacteria never entirely disappeared from the continent,
remaining present in rodent populations and occasionally causing new outbreaks. Smaller plague epidemics occurred regularly in subsequent centuries, though none matched the scale and impact of the 14th century pandemic. Each recurrence of plague reinforced the lessons learned during the Great Mortality and encouraged communities to maintain their disease prevention measures. Quarantine facilities were kept in readiness, public health officials were appointed to monitor for signs of disease, and communities developed standard procedures for responding to outbreaks. Communities that had survived the Black Death developed institutional knowledge about managing disease outbreaks that proved valuable for centuries. They maintained quarantine facilities even during healthy periods, established protocols for caring for the sick during epidemics, and preserved medical knowledge that had proven useful during previous outbreaks. The experience of living through pandemic conditions also influenced European attitudes toward death, suffering, and community responsibility in lasting ways. Art and literature from the later medieval period reflect a deep preoccupation with mortality and the fragility of human life. The dance of death became a common artistic theme, depicting people from all social classes united in their common fate. Religious art often portrayed death as an ever-present reality that could strike anyone at any time. Churches were decorated with images of skulls, skeletons, and other reminders of mortality. These artistic themes reflected the psychological impact of living through plague years, when death had been such a constant and immediate presence. Literature from the post-plague period also shows the influence of pandemic experiences. Writers like Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the Black Death in Florence, created works that explored themes of survival, morality, and human nature under extreme circumstances. The Decameron, Boccaccio's collection of stories told by plague survivors, remains one of the most vivid accounts of life during pandemic conditions.
Religious thought also evolved in response to plague experiences, though in complex and sometimes contradictory ways. Some people lost faith entirely, unable to reconcile their suffering with belief in a benevolent deity. Others developed more sophisticated theological understandings that could accommodate both divine love and earthly tragedy. Mystical traditions flourished as people sought direct spiritual experiences that could provide comfort in uncertain times. The practical knowledge gained during plague years influenced medical development for centuries to come. Physicians and other healers accumulated detailed observations about disease progression and treatment outcomes that proved valuable even when their theoretical understanding remained limited. Clinical experience provided foundation for gradual improvements in medical practice. The development of more systematic approaches to public health was another lasting legacy of plague years. Communities that had successfully managed epidemic conditions preserved their organizational techniques and adapted them to other types of health challenges. The concept that community authorities had responsibility for protecting public health became more widely accepted. The demographic recovery from the Black Death took many generations to complete. Population levels in most affected areas did not return to pre-plague numbers until the 16th century or later. This slow recovery reflects both the magnitude of the initial mortality and the continuing impact of smaller disease outbreaks in subsequent decades. During these recovery years, surviving communities rebuilt their social institutions gradually and carefully. New families formed, often bringing together people from previously separate social groups or geographic areas. Traditional craft guilds reformed with modified membership requirements that reflected changed demographic realities. Religious communities recruited new members to replace those lost to disease. Agricultural systems also required extensive rebuilding after plague mortality.
Many farms had been abandoned when entire families died or fled to other areas seeking safety or opportunity. Surviving communities had to decide which lands to cultivate and which to leave fallow. They experimented with new crops and farming techniques, sometimes adopting innovations that had been impossible under earlier social conditions. The gradual recovery process created opportunities for social mobility that had been rare in earlier centuries. People who survived the plague often found themselves inheriting property or positions that would have been beyond their reach in normal times. These changes contributed to the eventual breakdown of rigid feudal hierarchies and the emergence of more flexible social arrangements. Women sometimes gained new opportunities during recovery years, as they inherited property from deceased husbands or found new roles in communities that had lost many of their traditional leaders. Some became successful merchants or craftswomen, taking advantage of opportunities that would have been closed to them before the demographic disruption caused by plague mortality. Urban communities faced particular challenges in rebuilding their populations and economic activities. Cities required complex cooperation between many different occupational groups to function effectively. When key craftsmen or merchants died, their knowledge and skills often died with them. Surviving communities had to recreate this specialized knowledge through experimentation and gradual learning. The rebuilding of urban communities sometimes led to innovations and improvements over pre-plague arrangements. When traditional craft techniques were lost, surviving practitioners had to develop new approaches that sometimes proved more efficient or effective. Urban planning sometimes improved as communities rebuilt areas that had been devastated by plague mortality.
The experience of surviving pandemic conditions influenced how medieval communities prepared for other types of disasters. They developed better systems for storing food and other necessities during times of crisis. They established clearer protocols for maintaining order and distributing resources when normal systems were disrupted by catastrophe. Political institutions adapted to new realities created by plague mortality and social change. Rulers who survived the crisis often found their authority both weakened and strengthened in different ways. They had fewer subjects to govern, but those subjects were often more valuable and therefore more difficult to control through traditional means. Some rulers responded to post-plague conditions by becoming more responsive to their subjects' needs and concerns. They recognized that maintaining loyalty required offering better conditions and opportunities. Others attempted to restore traditional arrangements through force, with mixed results. The Church, as one of the few institutions that spanned all of European society, played crucial roles in facilitating recovery from plague devastation. Religious communities provided continuity and stability during years of rapid change. They preserved written knowledge that might otherwise have been lost when individuals and communities died. They maintained networks of communication that connected distant communities. Monasteries and convents often served as centers for preserving and transmitting practical knowledge about medicine, agriculture, and crafts. Their libraries contained books that preserved techniques and information that might otherwise have disappeared. Their educational activities helped train new generations of skilled practitioners in various fields. Individual responses to surviving pandemic conditions varied enormously, but certain patterns emerged across different communities and regions. Many survivors developed deeper appreciation for simple pleasures and everyday experiences that they had previously taken for granted. They valued human relationships more highly, perhaps recognizing how quickly such connections could be severed by death or separation. Some survivors became more cautious and conservative in their approach to life, preferring familiar routines to risky innovations. They had experienced firsthand how quickly life could change and preferred to maintain stability wherever possible. Others became more adventurous, reasoning that life was short and uncertain enough to justify bold choices and new experiences. Both responses represented rational adaptations to experiences of profound uncertainty and loss. People who had lived through pandemic conditions understood viscerally that life was fragile and unpredictable. Their subsequent choices reflected this understanding in different but equally reasonable ways. The psychological impact of living through pandemic conditions extended far beyond the immediate crisis years. Survivors carried memories of loss and fear for the rest of their lives, but they also carried knowledge of their own resilience and capacity for survival. They passed stories of survival and adaptation to their children and grandchildren, transmitting both trauma and wisdom across generations. These transmitted experiences shaped European culture in subtle but persistent ways. Attitudes toward risk, community responsibility, and individual resilience were all influenced by collective memories of plague survival. The knowledge that communities could survive even catastrophic disasters became part of European cultural heritage. Medical knowledge accumulated during plague years provided foundation for gradual improvements in healthcare over subsequent centuries. Physicians developed better understanding of contagion patterns, even without comprehending the underlying biological mechanisms. They refined techniques for caring for fever patients and managing pain during illness. The practice of careful observation and record-keeping during plague years contributed to more systematic approaches to medical learning. Physicians began keeping more detailed records of patient symptoms and treatment outcomes. These records provided data that could be analyzed and compared across different cases and locations. The practice of quarantine, refined during plague outbreaks, became a standard tool for managing disease transmission that remained in use for centuries. Port cities developed sophisticated systems for inspecting arriving ships and isolating potentially infected people or cargo. These practices proved effective enough to remain in use for many different diseases and circumstances. Community responses to plague challenges also provided models for dealing with other types of collective disasters. The organizational techniques developed for managing mass mortality proved useful during famines, wars, and natural disasters. The institutional knowledge gained during plague years became part of European civilization's toolkit for crisis management. The gradual process of demographic and economic recovery from the Black Death created new opportunities for innovation and experimentation that might not have emerged under normal circumstances. Communities that had lost traditional ways of doing things were forced to develop new approaches. Some of these innovations proved more effective than the systems they replaced. Agricultural techniques evolved as surviving farmers worked with different ratios of land to labor than their predecessors had experienced. They experimented with crop rotations, livestock management, and land use patterns that took advantage of changed demographic conditions. Some of these experiments contributed to gradual improvements in agricultural productivity over subsequent centuries. Craft production also evolved as guilds rebuilt their membership and training systems after losing many skilled practitioners. Traditional techniques were sometimes modified when master craftsmen died before fully training their apprentices. New combinations of materials and methods emerged from necessity, occasionally producing improvements over earlier practices. The experience of surviving pandemic conditions taught medieval communities important lessons about the value of cooperation and mutual support that continued to influence social relationships long after the immediate crisis had passed. People who had helped each other during crisis years often maintained those relationships during subsequent normal times. These strengthened social bonds contributed to community resilience in facing later challenges. Religious communities that had provided care during plague years continued their healing ministries during peacetime, often with expanded capabilities and deeper commitment. Monastic communities expanded their medical knowledge and healthcare facilities. They established hospitals and training programs that served their regions for centuries. Their accumulated experience became institutional knowledge that benefited many generations. The collective memory of pandemic survival also influenced European attitudes toward public health and community responsibility in ways that persisted long after the immediate crisis. People who had lived through plague years understood viscerally how individual health connects to community well-being. This understanding supported public health measures that might have seemed unreasonable to those without direct experience of pandemic conditions. The slow process of rebuilding communities after plague devastation required enormous patience and persistence from survivors who had to balance immediate needs with long-term planning. Progress was often interrupted by setbacks, including smaller disease outbreaks, economic disruptions, and political upheavals. Each generation had to balance preservation of useful traditions with adaptation to changed circumstances. Children who grew up during recovery years inherited both the trauma and the resilience of their plague survivor parents. They learned practical skills for dealing with uncertainty and loss, but they also absorbed cultural values emphasizing community solidarity and mutual aid. These transmitted experiences shaped European society for generations in ways both obvious and subtle. The process of cultural transmission was complex and varied across different communities and social groups. Some families preserved detailed memories of plague experiences, passing down specific knowledge about survival techniques and community organization. Others focused more on general lessons about resilience and cooperation. All contributed to the gradual development of European cultural responses to crises and disaster. Educational institutions played important roles in preserving and transmitting knowledge gained during plague years. Universities, cathedral schools, and monastic libraries maintained written records of medical observations, organizational techniques, and philosophical reflections on survival and community. These written sources provided continuity across generations and geographic regions. The development of more systematic record-keeping during and after plague years contributed to gradual improvements in administrative and medical practices. Communities that had learned to track mortality rates, resource distribution, and organizational effectiveness during crisis continued to use these techniques during normal times. This contributed to more effective government and better community planning. The Black Death and other medieval pandemics ultimately demonstrated both human vulnerability and human resilience in the face of overwhelming challenges that seemed impossible to survive. Communities that appeared completely devastated found ways to rebuild and continue. People discovered inner resources they had not known they possessed. Social institutions proved more adaptable than anyone had expected. The medieval experience of surviving pandemic conditions offers timeless lessons about human nature and community strength that remain relevant across centuries. People facing impossible situations often found ways to care for each other and maintain hope for the future, even when individual survival seemed unlikely. They preserved essential knowledge and skills even under the most difficult circumstances. They created new forms of cooperation when traditional systems failed to meet unprecedented challenges. Perhaps most importantly, medieval communities showed that recovery from even catastrophic disasters was possible, though it required patience, cooperation, and willingness to adapt to permanently changed circumstances. The Europe that emerged from the plague years was different from the Europe that had entered them, but it was still recognizably human, still capable of growth and creativity and love.
The lessons of medieval pandemic survival extend beyond historical curiosity to offer insights about human resilience and community cooperation that transcend specific time periods and circumstances. They remind us that people have always faced challenges that seemed insurmountable and found ways to not merely survive, but to build foundations for future generations. As we drift toward sleep, we can take comfort in knowing that our ancestors faced challenges that seemed insurmountable and found ways to not merely survive, but to build foundations for future generations. Their quiet courage and practical wisdom echo across the centuries, reminding us that human communities possess remarkable resilience when people choose to care for one another.
The stories of medieval pandemic survival are not tales of heroic individuals performing extraordinary feats, but rather accounts of ordinary people doing what was necessary to preserve life and community under extraordinary circumstances. They remind us that survival is often less about dramatic gestures than about patient persistence, daily acts of kindness, and mutual support sustained over long periods of difficulty. These medieval communities developed sophisticated understanding of what it meant to live together during times of crisis. They learned to balance individual needs with collective welfare, to maintain hope while acknowledging harsh realities, and to preserve essential knowledge while adapting to changed circumstances. Their approaches to community organization during emergencies reflected deep wisdom about human nature and social cooperation. The economic adaptations made during plague years reveal how flexible and creative human communities can be when traditional systems no longer function effectively. When familiar occupations disappeared, people learned new skills. When established trade routes became dangerous, merchants found alternative pathways. When traditional social relationships broke down, new forms of cooperation emerged to meet essential needs. The religious and philosophical responses to plague conditions show how humans seek meaning even in the darkest circumstances. People created new forms of spiritual practice that could accommodate both suffering and hope. They developed theological understandings that allowed for divine love even in the presence of catastrophic loss. They found ways to maintain faith while acknowledging the genuine difficulties of earthly existence. The role of women during plague years deserves particular recognition, as they often provided essential care and maintained community connections when formal institutions were overwhelmed or collapsed entirely. They preserved practical knowledge about healing, childcare, and household management that proved crucial for community survival. Their informal networks of mutual support often provided more effective assistance than official relief efforts. The gradual process of recovery after plague years demonstrates the importance of patience and persistence in rebuilding damaged communities. People understood that restoration would take generations rather than years. They made decisions that prioritized long-term stability over short-term convenience. They invested in institutions and relationships that would benefit their children and grandchildren rather than themselves. The educational legacy of plague years includes not only specific medical knowledge, but also broader understanding of community organization, crisis management, and human resilience. Universities and monasteries preserved written accounts of survival techniques, organizational innovations, and philosophical reflections that influenced European thought for centuries. This intellectual heritage became part of the foundation for future social and scientific development. The artistic and literary responses to plague experiences created cultural works that helped later generations understand and cope with their own challenges. The themes of mortality, community solidarity, and human dignity that emerged from plague years continued to influence European culture long after the immediate crisis had passed. These cultural contributions provided emotional and intellectual resources for facing subsequent difficulties.
The development of more systematic approaches to public health represents one of the most important legacies of medieval plague years. Communities learned to think collectively about health and disease prevention in ways that had not been common before the crisis. They developed institutional frameworks for managing community welfare that proved adaptable to many different types of challenges. The transformation of labor relationships after plague mortality created new opportunities for social mobility and economic development that influenced European society for centuries. The breakdown of rigid feudal hierarchies opened pathways for individual advancement, while also creating new forms of cooperation. These social changes contributed to the eventual emergence of more flexible and dynamic societies.
The international connections maintained during plague years through continued trade and communication helped preserve knowledge and resources that might otherwise have been lost. Despite the dangers of travel and commerce during epidemic conditions, people found ways to maintain the connections that linked distant communities. These networks proved essential for sharing survival techniques and coordinating recovery efforts. The interfaith relations during plague years reveal both the worst and best aspects of human nature under extreme stress. While some communities turned against minority groups in their fear and desperation, others demonstrated remarkable compassion and protection for vulnerable neighbors. These varied responses show that crisis can bring out either cruelty or kindness, depending on the choices made by individuals and communities. The long-term demographic changes caused by plague mortality created opportunities for environmental recovery and agricultural innovation that might not have occurred under normal circumstances. When human populations declined dramatically, some overused lands had opportunities to recover their fertility. New farming techniques developed to work with changed population densities sometimes proved more sustainable than earlier practices. The psychological adaptations made by plague survivors influenced European attitudes toward risk, uncertainty, and change for generations. People who had lived through catastrophic disruption developed different perspectives on the value of security versus opportunity. Some became more cautious, while others became more willing to embrace new possibilities. Both responses contributed to cultural diversity and resilience. The preservation of practical skills during plague years required conscious effort to maintain knowledge that might otherwise have disappeared when practitioners died. Communities developed new approaches to training and education that could function even when traditional master-apprentice relationships were disrupted. These innovations in knowledge transmission proved valuable long after the immediate crisis had passed. The medical observations made during plague years contributed to gradual improvements in healthcare that benefited many subsequent generations. Physicians and other caregivers accumulated detailed information about disease progression, treatment effectiveness, and patient care techniques. This practical knowledge provided foundation for continuing medical development even when theoretical understanding remained limited. The community organization techniques developed during plague years proved adaptable to many other types of challenges, including famines, wars, and natural disasters. The institutional knowledge gained through managing pandemic conditions became part of European civilization's toolkit for crisis response. These organizational innovations influenced governance and administration for centuries. The spiritual and philosophical legacies of plague years include not only specific religious developments, but also broader questions about meaning, purpose, and human dignity in the face of suffering. The theological and philosophical works produced during and after plague years influenced European intellectual development for generations. They provided frameworks for understanding tragedy while maintaining hope for renewal and recovery. The individual stories of survival and loss during plague years remind us that historical events consist of countless personal experiences of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. Each family had its own story of loss and adaptation. Each community developed its own approaches to survival and recovery. These individual experiences, when considered together, reveal the full complexity and humanity of historical change. The children who grew up during plague years carried forward both the trauma and wisdom of their experiences into adulthood. They became parents and community leaders who understood viscerally the importance of cooperation, preparation, and mutual support. Their transmitted knowledge influenced European society in ways both obvious and subtle, contributing to cultural resilience that proved valuable in facing later challenges. The gradual integration of plague experiences into European cultural memory created shared understanding of human vulnerability and community strength that transcended specific regional or national boundaries. People across the continent had shared similar experiences of loss, adaptation, and recovery. This common heritage contributed to broader European identity and solidarity. The economic innovations developed during plague years influenced commercial and financial development for centuries. New forms of credit, insurance, and trade organization emerged to deal with the uncertainties and opportunities created by demographic disruption. These financial innovations contributed to the eventual development of more sophisticated market economies. The technological adaptations made during plague years included improvements in medical equipment, sanitation systems, and food preservation techniques that proved valuable long after the immediate crisis had passed. Communities that had been forced to innovate during emergency conditions often retained these improvements during normal times. Some of these technological developments contributed to broader patterns of European innovation and development. The legal and administrative changes made during plague years influenced governance systems for generations. New approaches to property rights, inheritance law, and community organization emerged from the necessity of dealing with unprecedented demographic disruption. These legal innovations sometimes proved more effective than earlier systems and were retained long after the conditions that created them had passed. The international cooperation that developed during plague years, despite the dangers and difficulties of travel and communication, demonstrated that human communities could maintain connections even under the most challenging circumstances. The networks of mutual support that linked distant communities proved essential for sharing resources, knowledge, and hope during the darkest periods of the crisis. The environmental changes that occurred during plague years had long-term consequences that influenced European development for centuries. When human populations declined dramatically, some ecosystems had opportunities to recover from earlier overuse. Forest areas expanded, wildlife populations recovered, and some agricultural lands regained their fertility. These environmental changes created new opportunities and challenges for subsequent generations. The cultural synthesis that emerged from plague experiences combined traditional European heritage with new insights gained through survival and recovery. This cultural development influenced art, literature, philosophy, and religion for generations. The creative works produced during and after plague years reflected both the trauma of loss and the hope of renewal that characterized the European experience. The personal relationships formed during plague years often proved remarkably durable and influential. People who had helped each other survive the crisis maintained special bonds long after the immediate danger had passed. These relationships sometimes crossed traditional social boundaries, creating new forms of community solidarity that influenced social development for generations. The practical knowledge gained about community organization during emergencies became part of European institutional memory that proved valuable in facing many different types of challenges.
The techniques developed for coordinating relief efforts, maintaining order during chaos, and preserving essential services during disruption influenced governance and administration for centuries. The moral and ethical questions raised by plague experiences influenced European philosophical and religious thought for generations. How should communities balance individual rights with collective welfare during emergencies? What obligations do the healthy have toward the sick? How can people maintain human dignity in the face of catastrophic loss? These questions, first raised acutely during plague years, continued to influence European moral reasoning for centuries.
The educational innovations developed during plague years helped preserve and transmit knowledge under conditions that disrupted traditional learning systems. When established schools and universities were closed or decimated, communities found new ways to maintain literacy, preserve technical skills, and pass down essential knowledge. These educational adaptations proved valuable long after the immediate crisis had passed. The architectural and urban planning changes made during plague years influenced European city development for generations. Communities that rebuilt after plague devastation sometimes improved their layouts, sanitation systems, and public facilities. These improvements reflected lessons learned about community health and organization during the crisis years. The agricultural innovations developed during plague years contributed to long-term improvements in farming techniques and land management. When traditional farming systems were disrupted by demographic change, surviving communities experimented with new approaches that sometimes proved more effective than earlier methods. These agricultural developments influenced European food production for centuries. The commercial and financial adaptations made during plague years helped create more resilient economic systems that could function even under disrupted conditions. New approaches to banking, credit, and trade organization emerged from the necessity of conducting business despite unprecedented uncertainties. These financial innovations contributed to the development of more sophisticated market economies. The artistic and literary works created during and after plague years provide lasting testimony to human resilience and creativity even under the most difficult circumstances. These cultural contributions reflect both the immediate trauma of plague experiences and the longer-term process of recovery and renewal. They continue to offer insights into human nature and community strength that transcend their specific historical contexts. The medical and scientific observations made during plague years contributed to gradual improvements in healthcare and disease prevention that benefited many subsequent generations. The detailed records kept by physicians and other caregivers provided data that could be analyzed and compared across different cases and locations. This accumulation of practical knowledge provided foundation for continuing medical development. The social innovations developed during plague years influenced European society for generations, creating new forms of community organization and mutual support that proved adaptable to many different circumstances. The techniques developed for maintaining social cohesion during crisis, caring for vulnerable community members, and coordinating collective action became part of European social heritage. The religious and spiritual developments that emerged from plague experiences influenced European Christianity for centuries. New forms of devotion, theological understanding, and spiritual practice emerged from the necessity of finding meaning and hope in the face of catastrophic loss. These religious innovations provided emotional and intellectual resources for facing subsequent challenges. The political changes that occurred during and after plague years influenced European governance systems for generations. The demographic disruption and social change caused by plague mortality created new relationships between rulers and subjects, new approaches to law and administration, and new concepts of community welfare and individual rights. In the end,
The medieval experience teaches us that even the darkest periods of human history contain seeds of renewal and hope. Communities that seemed broken beyond repair found ways to heal and grow. People who had lost everything discovered that they still possessed the capacity to build new lives and new relationships. The knowledge that human communities have always found ways to endure, to care for one another, and to continue the long work of creating meaning and beauty in an uncertain world.
These gentle lessons from the distant past can accompany us into peaceful sleep, carrying the quiet assurance that human communities have always found ways to survive and thrive even in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. The medieval survivors of pandemic conditions left us not only the record of their struggles, but also the proof of their resilience, their creativity, and their enduring commitment to caring for one another across generations. Rest well, knowing that you are part of this continuing story of human resilience and hope, connected across the centuries to countless others who have faced their own challenges with quiet courage and mutual support. The wisdom of those who survived the Black Death and other medieval pandemics lives on in the institutions they built, the knowledge they preserved, and the example they set of human communities choosing again and again to care for one another, no matter how difficult the circumstances might become.